Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second Bite-Size Animal Law series. Our title for this series is Animal Law, Social Justice, and Their Interconnectedness. And as I said, this is our second series. Our first series, which was an introduction to animal law, is now on our YouTube channel for you to view. So we are in our fourth lecture of this series. The series will run every Monday at 7 p.m. until the 14th of December. Tonight, we are very fortunate to have with us Dr. Kadira Pethiyagoda. He will be discussing animal law and international human rights law. Dr. Pethiyagoda's career has spanned diplomacy, academia, and politics. His professional experience includes having been a diplomat, an advisor to Australia's shadow foreign minister, deputy opposition leader, senior advisor at Australia's Refugee Tribunal, fellow at the Brookings Institution and Geneva Centre for Security Policy, including consulting for UNOHCHR. He was Senior Associate Member at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University, and he was a Research Associate at the Oxford's Institute for Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict. Dr. Pethiyagoda has 4 degrees, including a PhD in International Relations and Masters in International Human Rights Law from Oxford, and is currently completing his 5th degree, the GDL. His book, Indian Foreign Policy and Cultural Values, is published by Palgrave Macmillan. Dr. Pethiyagoda has advocated for greater protections for animals through politics and academia, including as a candidate in the Australian election. He has published in Foreign Affairs, The Guardian, Independent, and The Huffington Post. He has appeared in BBC and ABC, as well as Al Jazeera and other channels as well. He's been cited as well in the New York Times. So if everybody could give a warm, silent welcome to Dr. Pethiyagoda. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. I know that you are in Australia and we are in the UK, so the time difference is quite a lot.
Thanks for having me, and thanks for staying up late in order to do the talk.
Don't worry about it. Thank you very much for taking your time to be here. So tonight we're going to do a Q&A style interview with Dr. Pethiyagoda. So I'll get started on the first question.
Sure.
Excellent. So you have a broad career spanning diplomacy, academia, and politics, in which you advocated for the greater protections for animals. Where does your passion for animal rights stem from?
I guess at the sort of earliest stage, it really stems from values that I was raised with, which is in part due to culture as well. But I think it also stems from observing and trying to engage in the struggle for equality in other contexts. And from my perspective, I feel that the treatment of animals, when you look at practices like factory farming, for example, is probably the greatest injustice of our time. And that's saying a lot. And I definitely feel it's what future generations will look back on our era and wonder how this could have taken place.
I think you're absolutely right. Definitely. You've said that you think the global pandemic could act as a significant turning point for our thinking as a society when it comes to animals. Can you elaborate a bit on this?
Yes, I feel that since World War II, in terms of, I guess, our lives and our standards of living in the West, we've really sort of been able to enjoy quite a secure standard of living. And that's actually in contrast to the majority of sentient beings that inhabit the planet. Whether it's amongst humans in terms of people living in the global south and having faced regular threats of disease, famine, and war, but also non-human animals whose lives have as we all know, have ranged from the brute freedom of the wild to the sort of unrelenting suffering of factory farming. And I think COVID-19, particularly at the start, was a bit of a wake-up call. Sort of woke us up out of this sort of protective slumber. And you can really see that with things like herd immunity, where there was an uproar over the concept and over the use. And I think that gives a bit of an insight in terms of how people are used to approaching human life. So the concept of herd immunity seemed to take a very utilitarian approach to life. And so you saw the media really pick up on that term, because we're so used to framing human life as in one category of being sacrosanct, and all other disposable things on the planet, whether they be mineral, vegetable, or sentient animal, in a different category. So I think COVID's really been like a cruel reminder that we are another species of animals, and that we're part of a food chain, and that where other organisms can sometimes get the better of us, and that we too are vulnerable to suffering and dying in large numbers. And I think that it's really been a sort of a slap awake in that sense.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And so your next book on international human rights law and animal rights is coming out. Would you care to talk us through some of your key arguments? I guess as well, keeping in mind that we do have a really broad audience of both academic and non-academic viewers as well.
So in this book, I argue that as scientific discoveries are made and social attitudes evolve, if international human rights law is to remain true to its core principles of universality and equality, it must adapt. And I say a major step forward towards doing this is to extend protections to non-human animals. And one of my main arguments is that international human rights law stems from very culturally specific values, coming from both Abrahamic religious traditions and the European Enlightenment. And I guess those sets of values characterize the dominant states in the international order at the time that human rights law was being formulated. But if we look at the range of cultures around the world, we see varying conceptions of the relative moral value of humans and non-humans. And I believe that ignoring this diversity weakens the universal legitimacy of IHRL. And I think that to justify claims towards universality, IHRL should avoid favoring one value system over another. And instead of doing that, it can look to science. And if we do look to science, then this reveals that extending human rights to animals is in line with both the principles and the language of IHRL's core documents, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And particularly equality, which is a fundamental principle of international human rights law. The only relevant criteria for determining who deserves protective rights should be whether a being's interests are impacted by the lack of those rights. And there's growing scientific evidence proving that many animals can suffer from the violation of certain rights, like freedom from torture. And exclusion of animals on the basis of characteristics that have been proven to be irrelevant, like intelligence or species membership, amounts to discrimination and a violation of IHRL's equality principle. And so I draw on, in this book, I draw on a more purposive approach to statutory interpretation that sort of gives effect to the spirit of the law. I argue that the text of the International Bill of Rights documents is flexible, as we can see in terms of gender terms that were used, that it was intended that its interpretation should evolve along with social values. So I draw on the idea that statutes are always speaking in that sense.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And when can we expect your next book?
Well, it's been slightly delayed, but I'm hoping for next year.
Ah, fantastic. Excellent. Okay. Culture has played a large part in your research. You recently published an academic book titled Indian Foreign Policy and Cultural Values with Palgrave Macmillan. I'd be interested to hear how culture relates to animals and international human rights law.
Yes, well, I think I seek to emphasize culture in the book because I feel it's important to dispel the myth spouted often by those who oppose animal rights laws, that animal rights is somehow an exclusively liberal, Western, bourgeois invention. And I argue that the unconscious ignoring of animals in IHRL is in line with particular socio-cultural and religious norms of the states that dominated the international order, as I mentioned. And these states, both due to Enlightenment and religion-rooted values, had two main assumptions with regard to considering animals. So firstly, there's a barrier or a dichotomy that separates all humans from all animals in some morally relevant way. And secondly, assumption B, that there was a relative lack of moral obligations to animals. But if we look at the large Asian religions and the indigenous traditions from Asia, Africa, Europe, Oceania, and the Americas, there has been a less distinct human-animal boundary. And if we actually were to line up all the religious traditions of the world, we would see that those that most influenced IHRL are actually at the most anthropocentric end of that spectrum. And so had certain other cultures been major powers at the time of IHRL's establishment, then it may have assumed quite a different character.
Interesting. Thank you very much. Apologize for the noise in the background. In particular, you talk about the South Asian religious and philosophical traditions and approach to animals.
Yeah, so I focus particularly on the South Asian indigenous dharmic traditions that taken together currently constitute the largest number of adherents in the world in terms of religion outside of the Abrahamic religions. And even though, of course, each major dharmic tradition is significantly diverse, including in their approach to animals, if we focus on assumption A, the dharmic traditions really evince a greater absence of a dichotomy between animals and humans due to the core philosophy of a unity in all things. And while ancient Hindu texts like the Vedas include animal sacrifice, there was also a less dividing line between human and animal, and various things could be sacrificed, including humans. And within humanity itself, Hinduism denotes a stratification via the caste system, which further indicates a single continuum of beings, which include both human and non-human. And with regard to assumption B, these traditions really seek to abjure harm to all living things via the principle of ahimsa, which means non-violence or non-harm. And the prevalence of vegetarianism is evidence of this. Ahimsa towards all beings was central to Buddhism, Jainism, and the forms of Hinduism that we see most associated with the contemporary Indian culture. And I think it's important in these religions, partly because it's seen as a step towards moksha or salvation, which is a central objective. And while this hasn't led to an articulation of inalienable rights for animals, no beings were really described within these traditions as having such rights, not even humans. And I think, in terms of most people today, they would associate ahimsa with Gandhi, who re-energized it in modern times, and who also himself was a proponent of protecting animals. And so if we look more closely, I guess, at the particular dharmic traditions, if we take Hinduism, for example, a text like the Bhagavad Gita contains doctrines that those who refrain from harming animals have what they call the highest attitude. The story involves the monkey god Hanuman, which can be seen as sort of an icon of resistance against animal misuse. And even the very fact that there are gods that exist in the form of non-human animals says a lot about the lack of dichotomy. If we talk about Jainism, another major dharmic tradition, the premise is that reality is really divided between ajiva, which is the non-living, which includes concepts like time, and the living, which is a category that includes all physical things, so human, animal, plants, and those we consider inanimate, like rocks, for example. And Jainism had a big impact on India. It affected for greater vegetarianism, and the inclusiveness is really explicit in a lot of Jain sutras, where it state things like all beings like pleasure and hate pain. I also look at Buddhism, the religion that's had the greatest influence across Asia and is the most global religion outside of the Abrahamic faiths. It's also particularly relevant given that it's played a role in shaping the two countries that have the largest populations and which are likely to dominate the world order in the future, India and China. And Buddhism is particularly relevant to human rights because its primary concern is the prevention of suffering, which I argue is one of the core objectives of human rights as well. And within Buddhism, you've got the core objective of enlightenment, which in theory is attainable by all beings. And in some of the mythical Buddhist stories, the Jataka stories, which detailed the Buddha's past lives, these include lives that he spent as an animal. And Buddhist texts are full of references to animals and show an acute sensitivity to their suffering. And so in relation to assumption B, the principle of ahimsa and positive attitudes towards all beings is very central to Buddhism. The Buddhist stories involve humans sacrificing their own lives to save animals, including the Buddha. Buddhist civilization across Asia has a history of legislating to protect animals. Emperor Ashoka from the 3rd century BC, who was the first to unify the subcontinent, enacted laws forbidding animal sacrifice, ritual slaughter, banned the killing of certain species. And under his influence, the royal family virtually gave up eating meat. And the role of Buddhism within modern India is often underestimated. Buddhism rose during the formative stages of Indian civilization and culture, and of the particular Indian culture that expresses itself today in the current nation state. Even though in terms of adherents, Buddhism is quite small in India today. But the Buddhist conceptions of non-discriminatory non-violence have continued to influence India long after Buddhism itself decreased in numbers. So you've had its legacies infusing both Hinduism and Jainism, and really buttressing the non-violent values that existed in these traditions. So, for example, you've got the Vaishnavites in medieval times, a Hindu grouping that began to frown on animal sacrifices and practice vegetarianism. And of course, it's also important to look at how these values influenced practical legal outcomes in more recent times, and practical policy outcomes. And I think it's important to note not just the strength or lack of strength of this influence, but also the trend of this influence. Because it's fairly obvious that despite some of these values in dharmic culture-dominated states, in practice, their laws and policies and actions have been less progressive with regard to animals than Western states. And the reason for this should not be seen as justification for the argument that animal rights laws are a sort of a Western imposition on non-Western societies. And there's two reasons for this. One is that, of course, while social values constitute ideals, they don't necessarily translate into practice. And practice itself is influenced by a range of factors: political, economic, and historical. For example, economic development in the West has translated to a stronger rule of law. In poorer societies, there's greater disparities between the powerful and the powerless, whether they be human or animal. And there's less intervention from the law often. Relatedly, economic desperation leads to greater abuse of animals, just as it leads to abuses of human rights like child labor. And secondly, it's important to note that prior to the colonial era, many of these societies lacked legal protections for humans that we now regard as connected to human rights. So in the 18th century, with a new set of values influencing Europe in the Enlightenment era, you had these values then being installed into the pre-existing legal systems of colonies. You had these legal systems in the colonies then criminalizing acts of extrajudicial killing of human beings, regardless of their status. For example, you had Sati, the killing of widows in India, being abolished by the British. But Western colonizers did not instill the same degree of new protections for animals. And of course, these were largely absent in Western societies as well at the time. And so while human rights abuses against humans were reduced, abuses against animals were not. And then in the last century, while Western societies developed rapidly economically, and science became a more powerful basis for norms in comparison to religion, the West increased its protection for animals in a sort of broad sense, advancing ahead of many non-Western states. And I think an interesting analogy is the British imposition upon India during the colonial era of the religion-underpinned anti-sodomy laws, which actually reversed the relative tolerance of homosexuality which was present in ancient India. And then you had present-day Indian legislators continuing these colonial era laws and ensuring that LGBTQI people in India enjoyed less legal protections than in Britain. And I think one of the human rights NGOs referred to those laws as this alien legacy. But with regard to animals, you can see that this is beginning to change, and you can see that in some of the statements and some of the judgments made in courts. For example, in the Kerala, in the Indian state of Kerala, the High Court questioned the legal barrier between humans and animals. And its statement really came from a sort of deep values and philosophical place. It sort of evinced a belief that animals should have rights in line with human rights, like the right to freedom from torture.
Thank you very much. That's all very fascinating, especially the judgments coming out of these cases. Your career has been focused on international relations and foreign policy. What impact do you think these will have on what we've discussed?
Well, I think that there is an interesting connection there, where rising Asian powers are becoming more vociferous in projecting their cultural norms into domestic legislation with regard to animals. And this you may see in the future, I guess, more of these countries' cultural norms influencing their approach to international law and treaties. Domestically, for example, you've got the political push in India for laws that ban cow slaughter, really sort of couched in this indigenous dharmic narrative and rhetoric that really sort of positions Indian values against the values imposed by colonial rule. And so while in the period around the birth of the International Bill of Rights, you saw at least tacit acceptance by certain global South states of norms that may not have been perfectly matched to their cultural values. In the future, you might see more obvious opposition. And of course, high levels of visible opposition to human rights norms, particularly by powerful states, create more strain on their legitimacy, and I guess creates further impetus for change. And I think that given that these countries have increasing geopolitical influence, in the long term, this will lead to a reshaping of international law and threatens to diminish IHRL's ability to influence behaviour. And just as in the last century, we saw near universally signed treaties like the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights being imbibed with values of the dominant powers of that day. In the next century, we may see states like India and China shape treaties according to their own values. And I think that it's important to look at the approaches that India and China have traditionally had toward international law and some of the principles. And these, for example, some of these principles are expressed in the 1954 India-China Panchsheel Treaty, which is rooted in Buddhist principles and celebrates shared Buddhist heritage. Noting that, even though these two countries have had in recent times and then in decades past as well, a lot of conflict and tension, they have a similar attitude with regard to international law, in that they feel that a lot of the norms in the international system were not fashioned by them. And I think that's an important thing to watch. And with regard to customary international law in the long term, I think that as the international community is increasingly influenced by Asian powers, behavior of states will evolve in particular new directions. And as such, so will the perceptions of the international community of what is required by customary international law.
Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about the politics behind the laws. You've been a politician and a political advisor. What do you think are the main roadblocks for animal rights politically, and what do you hope to see?
Yeah, sorry, I should also just note with regard to the question before that, I think that it's not necessarily that despite these cultures having a different set of values when it comes to human rights and animal rights, it's not necessarily the case that their greater influence will lead to necessarily better outcomes for animals. Because obviously, like, due to the factors mentioned there, it remains to be seen how their influence will sort of have an impact. But I think the point is that it's important to acknowledge some of these differences and to see how these values may shape the international system in the future. So, getting back to the question on politics, I think that there's obviously significant roadblocks, whether it's the ag-gag laws in Western countries that prevent activists exposing factory farms, or China's continuation of wet markets. And, I think that the COVID-19 pandemic has really exposed us to some of the huge amounts of suffering and mistreatment that happens across the world with regards to animals. But I think the commonality between even the wet markets and the ag-gag laws is what Barbara Nosk referred to as the animal industrial complex, which I think, whether it's China or the US or a range of other countries, has quite a strong lobbying power. And of course that would manifest in different ways in a country like China, where the state has a lot more control in relation to corporations, and as compared to states like the US. But generally speaking, it's obviously a very powerful industry. It seeks to, just going to the Western example, it seeks to shape legislation through directly influencing politicians, and also through impacting public opinion. And in terms of the public opinion aspect, it seeks to persuade the public that certain things that benefit the animal industrial complex are actually in the interests of the majority of people. For example, government subsidies to the industry, it would argue, are important to prevent job losses. And it also seeks to influence through values and identity. If you look at, with particularly, for example, if you take men as a target audience, in the US, you had the fossil fuel and the car industry encouraging men to drive gas guzzlers by linking it to patriotism and manliness. You had pro-war lobbies encouraging men to support wars by linking it to patriotism and manliness. And similarly, you've got the animal industrial complex encouraging men to consume meat by linking it to patriotism and manliness. So I think that it's an important lobby to watch, although we can see all around us the public opinion is turning against these interests. The legislation seems to be moving much more slowly, and I think this exposes the power that this lobby has over political leaders and lawmakers. And I think it's interesting that, unlike other lobbies, which influence state behavior and thereby international treaties and customary international law, like the pharmaceutical lobby, for example, the animal industrial complex is so pervasive that it really avoids, it managed just to avoid attention on it as a single entity. But I also think that this has also led to, this also means there's a lack of self-awareness within the animal industrial complex, that means that it's still quite in early stages when it comes to forming a unified identity and coordinating a strategy to combat animal rights activism. And I think that the degree to which the animal industrial complex has been exposed as a distinct and contiguous set of interests is really thanks to the animal rights movement. But of course, as we can see, and with organizations like yourself, there is hope, and there are strong political incentives for leaders to institute mass reforms. You've got obviously veganism's growth as an economic and social force, and even just personally as a political candidate, I saw internal polling that showed that anger at animal cruelty is something that crosses party lines and changes votes. I had over 1,000 individual conversations with voters, and animal protection was one of the few issues where there was near unanimous agreement, and across party lines. And I think that Western society is really moving strongly in one direction, particularly with regard to animals. And people are sort of waking up to the fact that where their values are moving with regard to animals is not reflected in the law. And this is complemented by certain, not all, but certain traditionalist pro-animal sentiments in non-Western countries like India, and you see it in Sri Lanka as well. as well as the growth of um, Indigenous animal rights movements across the global South. And I think that international human rights law can really complement this change. And in the past, it's proven to be a powerful factor in shaping state practice in areas where there's been powerful domestic lobbies that have opposed such change.
That is the end of my questions. Do you have any closing comments you'd like to add or share with any of the attendees?
I think that it's an exciting time. I think that it's becoming abundantly clear to people around the world that the dividing lines that we've placed between ourselves and animals are artificial, and they're not sort of universal truths. And I think the circle of compassion is growing to include non-human animals, and hopefully with organisations like yours, we can really make the law reflect this, both domestically and in terms of international law.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And if there's anything positive to come out of the pandemic, it's, I think, definitely shown just how big of a community there actually is. Having all these virtual events, it's kind of been able to see everybody who's actually part of this community that maybe we couldn't really see before due to lack of, maybe geography barriers. So it's really great to see. And we hosted a webinar today on careers, and just it's fantastic to see all the students wanting to get involved and all the people in this area to really help further animal interests. So on behalf of ALAW and all the attendees, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Pethiyagoda, for being here this evening and giving up your time to prep and present to us. And I'm sure everybody else, as I am, is very much looking forward to your next book coming out.